Picture this. It's 1849, and British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard is brushing centuries of sand from clay tablets in the ruins of ancient Nineveh. What he uncovers sends tremors through the Vatican's marble halls, not demonic texts or blasphemous heresies, but something far more unsettling. Stories. Stories of gods molding humans from clay, of sacred gardens beside four rivers, of worldwide floods that reset civilization. The same stories Christianity claimed as divine revelation, except these were carved in cuneiform millennia before Moses was even born. The Royal Library of Nineveh yielded over 20,000 tablets, each one a potential crack in the foundation of religious authority. Church officials weren't losing sleep over Satan's influence. They were terrified of humanity remembering what came before their carefully constructed narrative. These weren't coincidences or inspired parallels. They were echoes of suppressed history, fragments of a time when beings called the Anunnaki walked among humans as flesh and blood reality, not mythology. And according to the ancient Egyptian god of wisdom, Thoth, this forgotten truth explains why certain institutions have worked so desperately to keep humanity's memory buried beneath layers of rewritten history. Picture this. It's 1849, and Austen Henry Layard is standing in the ruins of ancient Nineveh, modern-day Iraq. The desert sun beats down mercilessly as his team carefully brushes centuries of dust from what appears to be just another pile of broken clay. But as the dirt falls away, something extraordinary emerges. Thousands upon thousands of cuneiform tablets, systematically arranged and catalogued. What they've discovered isn't just a random collection of ancient records, it's humanity's first known library. Now, imagine being one of those archaeologists, holding in your hands a tablet that's over 4,000 years old. The weight of it, the rough texture of the clay, the intricate wedge-shaped marks pressed into its surface by some scribe who lived when the pyramids were already ancient. You're literally touching the thoughts of someone who died millennia before Christ was born. That's exactly what happened when they uncovered the Royal Library of Nineveh, and what they found there would shake the foundations of everything the Western world believed about its own origins. The tablets weren't randomly scattered. They were organized with the precision of a modern university library. Creation myths, flood narratives, legal codes, astronomical calculations, and epic poems, all carefully preserved and cross-referenced. As scholars began the painstaking process of translation, working by candlelight in dusty university offices across Europe, they started recognizing stories. Stories that sounded remarkably, uncomfortably familiar. Take the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance. Here was a flood narrative featuring a man named Utnapishtim who builds an ark, saves animals, and sends out birds to find dry land. Sound familiar? But this wasn't some recently discovered variant of Noah's story. This was written down 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible even existed. The parallels were so precise it was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Then came the Atrahasis epic, another flood account, where the gods decide to wipe out humanity because we've become too noisy and numerous. The survivor, Atrahasis, receives divine warning and builds a vessel to preserve life. Again, we're looking at a narrative that predates biblical accounts by centuries, yet contains virtually identical plot points, themes, and even specific details about the flood's duration and aftermath. But perhaps most unsettling for Victorian scholars was the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. Here they found divine councils, making collective decisions about humanity's fate. The gods say, "Let us create humans," not "let me, but let us." The same plural language that appears in Genesis when God says, "Let us make man in our image." Suddenly, the mysterious plural pronouns in Hebrew scripture had an explanation, and it came from Mesopotamian divine councils called the Anunnaki. The more tablets they translated, the more parallels emerged. The Sumerian Dilmun, a paradise garden where humans lived in innocence until divine knowledge changed everything. The Mesopotamian Tree of Life and Tree of Knowledge, divine beings who came down to interact with humans, teaching them civilization but also corrupting them. Council meetings where gods debated humanity's fate, sometimes deciding to intervene, sometimes to destroy. Picture those Victorian scholars, many of them devout Christians, sitting in their libraries with growing piles of translated tablets on one side and their Bibles on the other. Every day brought new discoveries, new parallels, new evidence that the stories they'd been taught were unique revelations were actually part of a much older, more complex tradition. The intellectual earthquake this created was profound. Some of these discoveries were so controversial that we can't share all the details on public platforms. That's why we created our free Insights Academy newsletter, where we reveal the most confidential findings. Plus, you'll get a free copy of the Kybalion for a limited time. The Vatican's response was telling. Rather than engaging with these discoveries, rather than attempting to explain or contextualize them, they chose strategic silence. Church officials understood immediately what these tablets represented, a direct challenge to the claim that biblical narratives were unique divine revelations. If the same stories existed in earlier cultures, if the same divine councils and flood narratives and creation myths were already ancient when Hebrew scripture was being written, then what did that say about the supposed originality of biblical text? This pattern of discovery didn't stop with Mesopotamian tablets. As archaeology expanded across the ancient world, similar narratives kept surfacing. Egyptian flood myths, Hindu accounts of divine councils deciding humanity's fate, Greek stories of gods who came down from the sky to teach and corrupt humans, Mesoamerican legends of serpent beings who brought knowledge and civilization, Celtic myths of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Dana, who came from the sky and possessed advanced knowledge. What scholars were uncovering wasn't isolated mythology. It was a global pattern of remarkably consistent narratives about humanity's origins, divine intervention, great floods, and sky beings who shaped early civilization. Either every ancient culture independently invented nearly identical stories about their past, or they were all remembering something that actually happened. The implications were staggering. If these weren't myths but historical memories preserved in story form, then humanity's relationship with divine beings, the Anunnaki, the Watchers, the Elohim, wasn't unique to Hebrew culture. It was a shared human experience that predated organized religion by millennia. Consider the specific details that appear across cultures. Divine beings who possessed advanced knowledge, who taught humans agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, and writing. Beings who lived for extraordinarily long periods. Conflicts between different factions of these beings over how to treat humanity. Decisions made in divine councils that affected human civilization. And always the flood, a global catastrophe that wiped out most of humanity, with only a few survivors chosen to preserve human civilization. These weren't vague similarities that required creative interpretation. These were specific, detailed parallels that suggested either direct cultural transmission or shared historical memory. And they all pointed to the same conclusion. The stories in biblical scripture weren't original revelations, but later versions of much older accounts about humanity's actual past. The scholars translating these tablets weren't trying to undermine Christianity. Many were devout believers who hoped their discoveries would illuminate biblical truth. Instead, they found themselves confronting evidence that the foundation stories of Western religion were part of a much larger, much older narrative about human contact with advanced beings who called themselves by various names: Anunnaki, Elohim, Watchers, but who seemed to be describing the same entities across cultures and continents. That's when the real cover-up began. When those cuneiform tablets emerged from the ruins of Nineveh, they didn't just reveal humanity's oldest stories. They exposed something that would fundamentally challenge how we understand divine authority itself. Picture this: while later civilizations would bow before the absolute decree of a single, all-powerful deity, the Sumerians described something radically different. Their gods didn't rule through divine dictatorship. They governed through debate, discussion, and democratic consensus. The Anunnaki operated as what we might recognize today as a divine parliament. Major decisions affecting humanity weren't handed down from on high by a solitary ruler. They emerged from heated discussions, passionate arguments, and carefully negotiated compromises among the council members. Think about how revolutionary this concept becomes when you realize that our entire modern understanding of divine authority assumes the opposite. One God, one voice, one unquestionable command. Let me walk you through what these tablets actually reveal. The Epic of Atrahasis gives us perhaps the clearest picture of this divine democracy in action. When humanity's population exploded and their activities became too noisy for the gods' liking, the Anunnaki didn't simply decide to wipe them out. Instead, they convened their assembly. Enlil, the god of wind and storms, argued passionately for humanity's destruction. He was fed up with the constant racket, the endless demands for attention, the sheer chaos that human civilization had become. But here's where it gets fascinating, and where you can see why later religious authorities might find this narrative deeply threatening. Enki, the god of wisdom and water, stood up in that divine assembly and argued back, not whispered dissent, not quiet disagreement, but open debate with his fellow deity. He defended humanity's right to exist, proposed alternative solutions, and ultimately worked to undermine Enlil's flood plan by warning Atrahasis to build his ark. This wasn't a case of good versus evil, or divine versus demonic influence. These were peer-level divine beings, equals in the cosmic hierarchy, engaged in the kind of robust political debate you might witness in any functioning democracy. Some gods sided with Enlil's position that humanity had become an unmanageable problem. Others supported Enki's more compassionate approach. The final decision to send the flood came only after extensive deliberation, and even then, Enki's successful effort to save humanity through Atrahasis shows that the minority opinion could still take effective action. Now contrast this with the biblical flood narrative. God decides, God acts, end of discussion. No divine debate, no dissenting voices, no democratic process. The theological implications are staggering. If the Sumerian version preserves the older, more authentic account, and the archaeological evidence strongly suggests it does, then somewhere along the line, humanity's understanding of divine governance shifted from democracy to absolute monarchy. This council model wasn't just theoretical theology for the Sumerians. It directly influenced how earthly power operated. Mesopotamian kings didn't claim authority through individual divine right, the way European monarchs later would. Instead, they sought legitimacy through approval from the divine assembly. Royal inscriptions repeatedly emphasized that the king was chosen by the gods, plural, acting in council. The earthly ruler's authority derived from cosmic democracy, not cosmic dictatorship. You can still find echoes of this older understanding scattered throughout biblical texts, though later translators and theologians worked hard to explain them away. Remember the puzzling plural in Genesis, "Let us make man in our image." If creation itself required discussion among multiple divine beings, then the creative act wasn't the product of singular, absolute authority. It emerged from collaboration, consultation, and collective decision-making. The Book of Job preserves another fascinating glimpse of this divine council in action. The sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and Satan, whose name simply means the accuser or the prosecutor, engages in what amounts to a legal debate about Job's character. This isn't the cosmic battle between good and evil that later theology would construct. It's a courtroom scene, with different divine beings presenting their cases and arguing their positions before a decision gets made. The Book of Enoch, which the early Christian church eventually deemed too dangerous to include in the biblical canon, provides even more detailed descriptions of divine councils debating humanity's fate. The Watchers, those divine beings who descended to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge, face judgment not from a single deity, but from an assembly of their peers. Their punishment comes through collective decision, not imperial decree. Here's what makes this shift from divine council to monotheism so significant. It represents more than theological evolution. It reflects political consolidation. Replace divine democracy with divine monarchy, and suddenly earthly rulers can claim unquestionable authority from an unquestionable source. No more need to justify decisions through consensus or debate. No more accountability to multiple divine perspectives. Just pure, absolute, top-down control. The Vatican's concern with this narrative becomes crystal clear when you grasp its implications. If the divine realm operates through discussion, debate, and democratic process, then earthly religious authority should probably follow the same model. But that democratizes the sacred in ways that institutional power structures simply cannot tolerate. It suggests that even God's decisions emerge from conversation rather than decree, from wisdom gathered collectively rather than imposed unilaterally. Ancient Mesopotamian art reinforces this council concept beautifully. Cylinder seals and temple reliefs consistently show gods seated in assembly, engaged in discussion, their body language suggesting active debate rather than passive submission to a single authority figure. Compare these images with later religious art, where divine figures appear in strict hierarchies, with clear power relationships and unidirectional communication flowing from top to bottom. The transformation wasn't accidental. When you centralize divine authority, you create the theological foundation for centralizing earthly authority. When you eliminate divine democracy, you eliminate the cosmic model that might inspire earthly democracy. The Anunnaki Council represented something far more dangerous to institutional power than any demon or devil ever could. It represented the idea that even ultimate authority should be accountable, debatable, and subject to collective wisdom rather than individual will. Understanding this ancient democratic model of divine governance doesn't just change how we read old texts. It transforms how we think about authority itself, both sacred and secular, both ancient and modern. Picture this: you're holding two manuscripts. One is weathered, ancient, written on clay tablets that predate the pyramids. The other is familiar, bound in leather, containing stories you've heard since childhood. Now here's what will blow your mind. They're telling the exact same stories. Word for word, beat for beat, character for character. The only difference, one was written thousands of years before the other. Welcome to the most uncomfortable truth in religious archaeology. The stories that billions consider unique divine revelation are actually ancient remixes of even older Mesopotamian hits. Let's start with creation itself. The Babylonian Enuma Elish, carved into 7 tablets around 1100 BCE, follows an identical structure to Genesis's 7 days. Not similar, identical. Both begin with primordial chaos, separate light from darkness, divide the waters above from waters below, establish celestial bodies, create life, and finally rest. The sequence is so precise, it's like finding 2 identical symphonies where one composer clearly had the other's sheet music. But here's where it gets fascinating. The tone couldn't be more different. The Mesopotamian version reads like an epic battle manga, violent cosmic wars where gods literally tear each other apart to create the universe. Marduk doesn't speak the world into existence. He slaughters the chaos dragon Tiamat, splits her corpse in half, and uses her body parts as building materials for reality. Her ribs become the vault of heaven, her tears form rivers, her breasts become mountains. It's brutal, visceral, and absolutely nothing like the serene "let there be light" we know from Genesis. So what happened? Enter the Hebrew scribes during the Babylonian exile around 586 BCE. Suddenly, these monotheistic thinkers are surrounded by stories of cosmic battles and divine councils, the same Anunnaki democracy we explored earlier. They're hearing about Marduk's victory over chaos, about gods mixing their divine essence with clay to create humans, about perfect gardens where immortals dwell. And they think, these are incredible metaphors for divine truth, but we need to adapt them for our understanding of one God. The textual evidence is overwhelming. The Hebrew word tehom, meaning the deep in Genesis, is a direct linguistic descendant of Tiamat, the Babylonian chaos monster. When Genesis says, "Darkness was upon the face of the deep," it's referencing the same primordial chaos that Marduk battled. The difference is that instead of violent conquest, the Hebrew version presents peaceful divine command, transforming chaos into order. Look at humanity's creation. In the Mesopotamian Atrahasis epic, the god Enki mixes divine blood with clay to create humans as workers for the gods. Genesis softens this into God forming man from dust and breathing divine life into him. Same basic recipe, divine essence plus earth material equals humans, but one version has us as cosmic slaves while the other makes us beloved creations. The Garden of Eden parallels are even more striking. The Sumerian Dilmun, described in texts predating Genesis by over a millennium, is a perfect paradise where gods dwell, multiple rivers flow, death doesn't exist, and immortal beings tend divine gardens. Sound familiar? Both traditions place humanity's origins in a perfect garden with flowing waters, but with completely different purposes. The Sumerian gardens exist for divine pleasure and God-human interaction, while Eden becomes a test of human obedience and free will. Then we get to the flood story, and honestly, the parallels become almost comical in their precision. The Mesopotamian Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh feature Utnapishtim receiving divine warning about a coming flood, building an ark to specific dimensions, gathering animals, sending out birds to test for dry land, and offering sacrifice after landing. The Hebrew Noah follows this script so precisely that scholars joke about copyright infringement. Even the detail about sending out a raven first, then a dove, appears in both versions. What's remarkable is how the Hebrew scribes transformed these stories' meaning while preserving their structure. Where Mesopotamian gods flood the earth because humans are too noisy and disturbing their sleep. Seriously, that's the actual reason given. The Hebrew version presents the flood as moral judgment. Same event, completely different divine character. This pattern repeats throughout what we call the primeval history, those first 11 chapters of Genesis covering creation through Babel. Nearly every major narrative has Mesopotamian precedents, but each has been theologically retrofitted for monotheistic purposes. The Tower of Babel echoes Mesopotamian ziggurat building traditions and divine language confusion myths. Cain and Abel reflects ancient tensions between nomadic and agricultural societies that appear throughout Near Eastern literature. Now, acknowledging these parallels doesn't diminish Scripture's profound spiritual value. It actually reveals something beautiful about human meaning-making. These stories became universal because they address fundamental questions every culture faces. Why do we exist? Why is there suffering? What is our relationship with the divine? The Hebrew scribes didn't plagiarize. They participated in humanity's ongoing conversation about ultimate meaning. But here's why institutions resist this archaeological reality. It complicates the unique divine revelation narrative. If Genesis shares DNA with Babylonian creation myths, if the flood story appears across multiple cultures, if Eden has Sumerian siblings, then Scripture becomes part of a larger human tradition rather than a standalone divine download. That's theologically challenging but historically honest. The evidence keeps mounting. Every archaeological dig in Mesopotamia reveals more parallels, more shared motifs, more proof that the ancient world was a cosmopolitan place where stories traveled trade routes like spices and silk. The Hebrew Bible represents one brilliant adaptation of widespread ancient traditions, not their original source. Understanding these connections doesn't destroy faith. It reveals how human cultures have always wrestled with the same profound questions, creating stories that speak across millennia because they address universal human experiences. The clay tablets and sacred scripture aren't enemies. They're family members in humanity's ongoing quest to understand our place in the cosmos. The real question isn't whether these parallels exist. Archaeology has settled that debate. The question is whether we're brave enough to embrace a more complex, interconnected understanding of how sacred stories develop and why they endure. Picture this. You're standing in the ruins of ancient Babylon, and carved into the temple walls before you are serpents coiled around the tree of life, their eyes gleaming with wisdom, their presence radiating protection and knowledge. Fast forward 3,000 years, and that same serpent has become Christianity's ultimate villain, the deceiver in Eden, the very embodiment of evil itself. This isn't just a story about changing religious beliefs. This is about one of history's most calculated rebranding campaigns, and understanding it reveals exactly why certain ancient knowledge had to be buried. In the earliest Mesopotamian texts, serpents weren't the enemy of divine wisdom, they were its guardians. The Sumerians understood something profound about these creatures. Every year, a serpent sheds its skin completely, emerging, renewed, transformed, essentially reborn. To ancient minds, this wasn't just biology, it was the perfect symbol of immortality, of the soul's ability to transcend physical limitations and access higher knowledge. Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom and fresh water, appears throughout their art either with serpentine features or accompanied by serpent guardians. These weren't decorative choices. In Sumerian cosmology, Enki was humanity's great teacher, the deity who gave us the gifts of civilization, writing, mathematics, agriculture, metallurgy, and his serpent companions. They were the protectors of this sacred knowledge, coiled around the temples where wisdom was preserved and transmitted. The Apkallu, those 7 sages we discussed earlier, who brought civilization to humanity, were often depicted with serpentine or fish-like characteristics in Akkadian art. Think about what this really means. The very beings credited with lifting humanity from ignorance to enlightenment were shown as serpent-like creatures. They weren't demons or deceivers. They were revered as the greatest gift the gods had given to mankind. Walk through any ancient Near Eastern museum today, and you'll see this pattern repeated endlessly. Serpents carved above doorways as protectors. Serpents wrapped around sacred trees, not as threats, but as guardians. Serpents in the hands of healers and priests, representing the power to cure disease and extend life. The symbol was so universally positive that it crossed cultural boundaries, from Mesopotamia to Egypt to early Canaanite religions. But here's where the story takes its dramatic turn. When Hebrew scribes began crafting their creation narrative, they had access to all these earlier traditions. The tree, the garden, the divine knowledge, even the serpent, these weren't original Hebrew concepts. They were borrowing from a vast library of ancient Near Eastern mythology. But they made one crucial change that would echo through millennia. They flipped the serpent's role completely. In the Garden of Eden narrative, that ancient symbol of wisdom and renewal becomes the great deceiver. The serpent who once protected divine knowledge now corrupts it. The creature who symbolized humanity's elevation now causes its fall. This wasn't an accident or a natural evolution of the symbol. This was deliberate theological engineering. Why would they do this? Because knowledge itself had become the enemy. In the earlier Sumerian accounts, when the gods gave humanity wisdom, it was celebrated as the greatest gift imaginable. But in the Hebrew reworking, the acquisition of knowledge becomes rebellion against divine authority. Eve's desire to be wise transforms from natural human curiosity into the original sin. This pattern appears everywhere once you recognize it. The Watchers in the Book of Enoch, remember, these were originally divine teachers who came to Earth to educate humanity. They taught astronomy, metallurgy, cosmetics, even writing itself. But in the Enochian literature, these same gift-giving teachers become fallen angels, and their knowledge becomes corruption. Teaching humans to read the stars? That's now forbidden divination. Sharing the secrets of metalworking? That leads to warfare and violence. The Nephilim follow the same transformation. In the earliest traditions, giants were mighty heroes, legendary figures whose strength and wisdom made them natural leaders. But by the time we reach the Hebrew scriptures, these same giants have become symbols of corruption so complete that God must destroy the world with a flood to cleanse it of their influence. You see the pattern. Divine teachers become fallen angels. Wisdom bringers become deceivers. Heroes become villains. And always, the knowledge they brought becomes dangerous, forbidden, corrupting. This wasn't random cultural drift. This was a systematic campaign to establish clear boundaries between approved and forbidden knowledge. By making the serpent evil, Hebrew theology created a framework where curiosity about divine mysteries became literally satanic. Questioning authority wasn't just rebellion, it was aligning yourself with the forces of darkness. The brilliance of this transformation is almost breathtaking in its completeness. Every positive symbol from the older traditions gets inverted. The tree of knowledge becomes forbidden fruit. The wise serpent becomes the tempter. The divine teachers become fallen angels. The mighty heroes become corrupted giants. What was once humanity's greatest achievement, the acquisition of wisdom, becomes its greatest shame. And this framework didn't disappear with ancient Judaism. When Christianity emerged, it inherited and amplified these inversions. The early church fathers doubled down on serpent as Satan imagery, making it central to Christian iconography. Medieval art is filled with images of saints trampling serpents underfoot, of Mary crushing the serpent's head, of the serpent wrapped around the tree of death rather than life. The Vatican's later emphasis on this symbolism wasn't accidental either. By the time the Catholic Church was consolidating power in the Roman Empire, they faced a problem. People throughout the Mediterranean still remembered the older traditions. They still associated serpents with healing and wisdom. They still told stories of divine teachers who had elevated humanity through knowledge. The solution was to make curiosity itself seem spiritually perilous. Question the official narrative about creation. You're following the serpent's path. Seek knowledge outside approved channels. You're repeating Eve's sin. Wonder about those ancient texts that tell different stories. You're opening yourself to demonic deception. This is why understanding the serpent's transformation matters so much. It reveals the exact mechanism by which ancient knowledge was not just suppressed, but actively demonized. The symbols that once celebrated human wisdom and divine teaching were systematically inverted to create fear around those very concepts. When you realize that the serpent was once humanity's greatest ally in the quest for knowledge, the entire framework of forbidden wisdom starts to crumble. And that's exactly what certain institutions never wanted you to discover. When you hold a piece of stone in your hands, you're touching something that will outlast empires, outlast civilizations, outlast the very memory of the words carved into its surface. The ancients understood this profound truth about permanence, and they used it to encode the most dangerous idea in human history, that power itself flows from written divine decree. Picture this scene from 4,000 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. In the shadowed chambers of ziggurats, priests guard tablets unlike any others, not the everyday clay records of grain shipments or marriage contracts, but stone tablets containing what they called the tablets of destiny. These weren't religious artifacts in the way we might think of them today. They were understood to be the actual operating system of reality itself. The Mesopotamians believed these tablets contained the fundamental algorithms that governed both divine and mortal realms. Whoever possessed them didn't just rule by divine right, they literally controlled the mechanics of cosmic order. Think of them as the ultimate source code, written in cuneiform script that predates our biblical traditions by over 1,000 years. The myths surrounding these tablets reveal something extraordinary about how ancient peoples understood power. In the Akkadian epic of Anzu, a powerful bird demon steals the tablets of destiny from the supreme god Enlil. The moment those tablets leave Enlil's possession, cosmic chaos erupts. The natural order collapses, rivers flow backward, seasons reverse, and the boundary between heaven and earth dissolves. This isn't metaphorical language. These texts describe the tablets as containing the actual laws that maintain physical reality. But here's where it gets fascinating. The myth doesn't end with chaos. Other gods must fight desperately to recover the tablets, not because they're symbols of authority, but because without them, existence itself unravels. The god who ultimately retrieves them doesn't just restore order, they become the legitimate ruler of both divine and human realms. The tablets don't represent power, they are power itself, encoded in permanent stone. This pattern appears throughout Mesopotamian literature with remarkable consistency. Kings didn't claim they were chosen by gods, they claimed the gods had literally written their names on imperishable tablets before the foundation of the world. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in black stone around 1750 BCE, begins with Hammurabi declaring that the god Marduk commanded him to cause justice to prevail in the land and to inscribe my precious words on my monument. Notice that phrasing, the laws aren't Hammurabi's creation, they're divine words he's merely transcribing onto permanent stone. Now, let's jump forward several centuries to a mountain in the Sinai Peninsula. Moses ascends Mount Sinai and receives the 10 Commandments, written by the finger of God on tablets of stone. If you've been following the pattern we've been tracing through these earlier sections, from the Sumerian creation accounts that preceded Genesis, to the serpent's transformation from wisdom guide to enemy, this moment should feel familiar. It's the same template, the same understanding of how divine authority transfers to human leadership. But notice the crucial details that connect this biblical account to those ancient Mesopotamian traditions. The commandments aren't written on papyrus, which would decay. They're not recorded in ink, which would fade. They're carved into stone by divine hands, making them as permanent as the cosmic laws encoded in those Mesopotamian tablets of destiny. The medium is the message. Divine law requires an imperishable foundation. The parallel becomes even more striking when you examine what happens next. Moses descends the mountain to find the Israelites worshipping the golden calf. In his anger, he shatters the stone tablets. This moment of destruction creates a crisis that mirrors those Mesopotamian myths where the tablets of destiny are lost or stolen. Without the written divine law, legitimate authority dissolves into chaos. The people have no binding covenant, no foundation for social order. But just as in the Mesopotamian accounts, the solution involves recovering and restoring the tablets. God commands Moses to carve new tablets and the divine words are inscribed again. Order returns, authority is re-established, and Moses becomes the legitimate mediator between divine will and human understanding. The pattern is identical. Written divine law on permanent stone creates the foundation for earthly governance. What's particularly revealing is how both traditions understood the fragility of these seemingly indestructible foundations. Stone may be permanent, but tablets can be broken, stolen, or lost. This paradox, eternal law encoded in breakable objects, appears in culture after culture because it reflects a deeper truth about power itself. Authority may claim divine origins, but it depends on human institutions to preserve and interpret it. This is where the priesthood enters the picture, and this is where we begin to see the blueprint that would eventually shape Vatican authority. In both Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, the written divine law requires authorized interpreters. The tablets themselves are just the beginning. Someone must read them, explain them, apply them to specific situations. The priests become as sacred as the texts themselves because they control access to divine meaning. Consider how this evolved in later Christian tradition. The Catholic Church didn't just preserve biblical texts, it claimed exclusive authority to interpret them correctly. Papal infallibility, declared as official doctrine in 1870, extends this ancient pattern to its logical conclusion. The institution becomes the living embodiment of those stone tablets, the permanent foundation for divine authority on earth. But here's what makes this historical progression so significant for understanding the Vatican's relationship with pre-Christian traditions. The Church didn't invent this model of authority. It inherited and adapted a system that was already ancient when Moses climbed Mount Sinai. The idea that divine law, written in permanent form and interpreted by authorized priests, creates the priest's foundation for legitimate earthly power, traces back to those Mesopotamian ziggurats where the tablets of destiny were first guarded. When you understand this deep historical continuity, you begin to see why certain ancient texts and traditions might represent a threat to established religious authority. They reveal the borrowed nature of supposedly unique divine revelations, showing how the same patterns of legitimacy appear across cultures and centuries, each claiming to be the original and exclusive truth. The stone endures, but the hands that carved it, and the institutions that interpret it, tell a far more complex story about power, continuity, and the human need to encode authority in forms that claim to transcend human questioning. When archaeologists first started digging into the ancient tells of Mesopotamia in the 19th century, they couldn't have imagined they were about to unearth evidence that would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship. What they found wasn't just clay tablets and pottery shards. They discovered layers of silt and sediment that told the story of catastrophic flooding events that repeatedly devastated the region between 4000 and 2900 BCE. The geological evidence is undeniable. Core samples from the Persian Gulf reveal massive freshwater discharge events that would have turned the entire Mesopotamian basin into a vast inland sea. These weren't gentle seasonal floods. We're talking about wall of water catastrophes that wiped entire civilizations off the map. And here's what's fascinating. These real, devastating floods became the seed memory that grew into humanity's most persistent story. But here's where it gets interesting for our understanding of how the Vatican has handled inconvenient truths. The flood story didn't originate with Noah. It didn't even originate with the Hebrews. The oldest version we have comes from Sumerian tablets dating back over 4,000 years, the Epic of Atrahasis. And when you read it alongside the biblical account, the parallels aren't just striking, they're virtually identical. In the Sumerian version, the gods grow tired of humanity's noise. Literally, we're keeping them awake, and decide to wipe us out with a great flood. But Enki, the god of wisdom and water, takes pity on a righteous man named Atrahasis. Sound familiar? Enki secretly warns him, "Build a boat, take your family, gather the animals." The instructions are so specific they include measurements for the vessel and detailed survival protocols. Now jump forward a few centuries to the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh, where we meet Utnapishtim, essentially the same character with a different name. The story has evolved, but the core elements remain unchanged. Divine judgment through water, one family chosen for survival, animals saved in pairs, and here's a detail that should make anyone pause. The hero releases birds to test whether the waters have receded. First a dove, then a swallow, finally, a raven. When the raven doesn't return, he knows land has emerged. Compare this to Noah's account in Genesis. The structure is identical, the details match, even the bird sequence is the same. But there's a crucial difference in framing that reveals how each culture adapted the story to serve their theological needs. In the Mesopotamian versions, the gods are capricious, almost petty. They destroy humanity over noise complaints, then immediately regret it when they realize they've eliminated their source of worship and sacrifice. The flood isn't about divine justice, it's about divine politics gone wrong. The biblical version transforms this same narrative into something entirely different. Here, the flood becomes an expression of divine justice, a moral reckoning where righteousness is rewarded and wickedness punished. Same story, completely different theological framework. This isn't accidental, it's sophisticated cultural adaptation. But here's where this gets truly mind-bending. These aren't the only cultures preserving this memory. Travel to ancient India, and you'll find the story of Manu, warned by a great fish, actually Vishnu in disguise, to build a boat before the world is destroyed by flood. The fish even tows Manu's vessel to safety, and from Manu comes the new human race. In Greek mythology, Zeus decides to destroy the bronze race of humans through flood, but Prometheus warns his son Deucalion to build an ark. After 9 days and nights, their vessel comes to rest on Mount Parnassus. They repopulate the earth by throwing stones that transform into people, a different mechanism, but the same core narrative of destruction, salvation, and renewal. Cross the Pacific, and you'll find Native American tribes from Alaska to South America telling variations of the same story. The Hopi speak of the destruction of the Third World by flood, with only the righteous surviving to populate the Fourth World we inhabit now. The Lakota tell of a great flood that covered all but the highest peaks, with humanity preserved in a great canoe. Even in China, ancient texts describe how the goddess Nuwa saved humanity from a catastrophic flood by repairing the broken pillars of heaven. Different cultural details, same fundamental memory. The world was once destroyed by water, but a remnant survived to begin again. Now, you have to ask yourself, how do geographically separated cultures, with no contact for thousands of years, independently develop virtually identical narratives? The mainstream academic explanation is that flood myths arise naturally because flooding is a universal human experience. But this doesn't explain the specific shared details, the divine warning, the boat, the animals, the birds, the moral framework of judgment and salvation. Carl Jung would have called this evidence of the collective unconscious, archetypal memories encoded in human psychology. Others suggest these stories preserve actual historical memory of catastrophic flooding events at the end of the last ice age, when massive ice dams burst and ocean levels rose dramatically across the globe. But there's a third possibility that connects directly to everything we've been exploring about suppressed knowledge. What if these stories preserve memory of actual intervention? What if the Anunnaki accounts aren't mythology but historical records of how an advanced civilization helped preserve human knowledge and genetics through a genuine catastrophe? The Vatican's approach to these flood parallels perfectly illustrates their broader strategy for handling pre-biblical traditions. They acknowledge the similarities, they have to. The evidence is overwhelming, but they frame them as foreshadowing or preparation for the true biblical revelation. The earlier stories become incomplete glimpses of divine truth that reaches full expression only in Hebrew scripture. This interpretive framework allows the Church to maintain biblical authority while acknowledging historical reality. But it also reveals something crucial. They understand these stories are connected, that there's a deeper truth linking all these traditions. The question is whether that truth is about divine revelation progressively unfolding through history, or about shared human memory of actual events that have been systematically reinterpreted to serve institutional power. The flood narratives aren't just ancient stories. They're a map showing us how foundational human memories have been shaped and reshaped to support different forms of authority. Understanding this process gives us insight into how other crucial knowledge might have been transformed, adapted, or suppressed entirely. When you realize that humanity's most persistent story existed long before it appeared in the Bible, you start questioning what else might have been rewritten, reframed, or buried entirely. And that's exactly the kind of questioning the Vatican has spent centuries trying to prevent. The most revealing evidence of suppressed divine counsels lies hidden in plain sight within the Hebrew language itself. When you examine Genesis carefully, something extraordinary emerges that traditional theology has struggled to explain for millennia. The Hebrew word Elohim is grammatically plural. It literally means gods. Yet throughout Genesis, this plural noun is consistently paired with singular verbs. It's as if the text is saying, "The gods he created," instead of "the gods they created." This isn't a translation quirk or scribal error. It's a linguistic fossil preserving an older theological reality. But the real bombshell comes in Genesis 1:26. Let us make man in our image. Who exactly is this us? Traditional Christianity attempts to explain this through Trinity doctrine, but that theological framework wouldn't be developed for centuries. Jewish scholars often suggest it refers to God consulting with angels, but that interpretation feels forced when you examine the broader context. The pattern continues in Genesis 3:22. Behold, man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Again, we see this mysterious plural. The text isn't describing a singular deity talking to subordinate angels. It's preserving the memory of a divine council where multiple divine beings deliberate together. Psalm 82 provides even more explicit evidence. Here we find God standing in the divine assembly, judging among the gods. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. This isn't metaphorical language about earthly rulers, as later interpretations claim. The Hebrew Elohim clearly refers to divine beings, and the structure mirrors Mesopotamian accounts of divine assemblies almost perfectly. What we're witnessing is the theological evolution from henotheism to monotheism. Henotheism acknowledges the existence of multiple gods, while worshipping only one as supreme. The biblical text preserves this transitional phase where Yahweh is elevated above other divine beings, rather than denying their existence entirely. Psalm 82 continues, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die, and fall like any prince. This depicts Yahweh demoting other gods rather than claiming they never existed. The Sons of God passages provide another crucial piece of evidence. In Genesis 6, these divine beings descend to earth and intermarry with human women, producing the Nephilim. Job opens with the sons of God, presenting themselves before Yahweh, with Satan among them as a member of this divine court. These aren't angels in the later Christian sense. They're members of a divine council with significant autonomy and authority. The structural parallels with Mesopotamian divine assemblies are unmistakable. In both traditions, a supreme deity presides over a council of lesser divine beings who debate human affairs, deliver reports, and receive assignments. The Mesopotamian tablets describe how the Anunnaki would gather to decide humanity's fate, with Enlil, Enki, and others presenting different perspectives to Anu, the supreme god. The Book of Enoch, though excluded from the biblical canon, preserves even more explicit council imagery. It describes the Watchers, members of the divine council who rebel against the supreme authority and descend to teach forbidden knowledge to humanity. This narrative framework is identical to Mesopotamian accounts of divine beings sharing advanced knowledge with early civilizations. Here's where the Vatican's concern becomes clear. Early Christian theologians recognized that these plural divine references created serious theological problems for emerging monotheistic doctrine. The development of Trinitarian theology can be understood as an attempt to preserve the divine plurality evident in Scripture while maintaining monotheistic claims. It's an elegant theological solution, but it required centuries of complex philosophical development to reconcile the obvious contradictions. The linguistic evidence extends beyond Hebrew into the broader Semitic language family. Akkadian texts use similar plural forms when referring to divine assemblies, and the grammatical structures in Genesis mirror these earlier patterns. It's as if the Hebrew scribes were translating older polytheistic narratives into a monotheistic framework while preserving the original linguistic forms. Consider how this evolution unfolded practically. Early Israelite religion clearly acknowledged other gods while claiming Yahweh as their particular deity. The commandment, "You shall have no other gods before me," doesn't deny the existence of other gods. It establishes a hierarchy. Only later do we see the development of strict monotheism that denies other gods' reality entirely. The theological implications are profound. Rather than undermining faith, recognizing this evolution reveals how monotheistic traditions develop through complex cultural interactions rather than sudden divine revelation. The biblical text preserves this process, showing how earlier polytheistic traditions were absorbed and transformed rather than simply eliminated. This historical development threatens institutional religious authority because it suggests that sacred texts emerged through cultural evolution rather than unique divine dictation. If biblical monotheism developed from earlier polytheistic traditions, then claims of exclusive divine revelation become harder to maintain. The Vatican's historical suppression of comparative religious studies makes perfect sense from this perspective. Understanding these divine council traces doesn't diminish the spiritual value of monotheistic traditions, it reveals their sophisticated theological development. The movement from acknowledging multiple divine beings to asserting one supreme deity represents a remarkable intellectual and spiritual evolution. But recognizing this process requires abandoning claims of unique, pristine revelation in favor of understanding how human communities develop increasingly sophisticated theological concepts over time. The evidence is embedded in the language itself, preserved despite centuries of theological reinterpretation. These linguistic fossils tell a story that institutional religion has worked hard to obscure, revealing the complex historical roots of monotheistic faith. The most devastating weapon against truth isn't destruction, it's selective preservation. While we've traced how flood narratives and divine council language survived within biblical texts, what's equally revealing is what didn't survive, and more importantly, who decided what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. When Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, the agenda wasn't just theological, it was political. The early church faced a massive problem: dozens of competing Christian texts, many containing narratives that aligned uncomfortably well with pre-Christian traditions. The solution wasn't to debate their authenticity, but their usefulness. Texts that supported emerging orthodox doctrine stayed. Those that didn't were labeled heretical. Consider what happened to the Book of Enoch. This text, quoted directly by New Testament writers and clearly influential on early Christian thought, contained detailed accounts of the Watchers, divine beings who descended to earth, shared forbidden knowledge, and produced hybrid offspring. Sound familiar? These weren't vague parallels to Mesopotamian traditions. They were nearly identical narratives. Too identical for comfort. The Church Fathers faced an impossible choice: acknowledge that their foundational stories had clear precedents in earlier cultures, or suppress the evidence. They chose suppression, but they couldn't eliminate everything. Instead, they developed a sophisticated system of managed ignorance, preserving just enough to maintain scholarly credibility while burying anything that threatened their claims of divine uniqueness. The apocryphal books tell this story perfectly. Texts like 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs contained explicit references to divine councils, rebellious angels, and knowledge-bringing entities that mirrored Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki. These weren't subtle parallels, they were direct continuations of the same narrative tradition we explored in earlier sections. But rather than acknowledge this continuity, church authorities relegated these texts to secondary status, calling them useful for reading, but not canonical. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 revealed just how extensive this suppression had been. Hidden in sealed jars for over 1,600 years, these Gnostic texts preserved Christian traditions that emphasized direct divine knowledge, multiple divine emanations, and cosmological frameworks that looked remarkably similar to ancient polytheistic wisdom. The Gospel of Philip speaks of multiple divine realms. The Apocryphon of John describes a complex hierarchy of divine beings. These weren't heresies, they were alternative Christian traditions that preserved older ways of understanding divine reality. What's fascinating is how these texts survived at all. They weren't preserved in monasteries or church libraries. They were literally buried in the desert by communities who knew they were about to be destroyed. The fact that we can read them today is pure chance, a testament to how thoroughly the institutional church succeeded in eliminating competing narratives. The Vatican's approach to these discoveries reveals everything about their strategy. Rather than welcoming new insights into early Christian diversity, church scholars consistently worked to minimize the significance of finds that challenged orthodox narratives. When the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed Jewish traditions that influenced early Christianity, Vatican-affiliated scholars spent decades controlling access to the materials, releasing information slowly and always with interpretations that supported existing doctrine. This pattern continues today. The Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly called the Secret Archives until 2019, when even they realized how that sounded, contain an estimated 85 kilometers of shelving. While recent popes have opened some materials for research, persistent questions remain about texts that might reveal uncomfortable parallels with pre-Christian traditions. We know they possess extensive collections of ancient manuscripts acquired over centuries. We know they have materials related to early church suppression of competing texts. What we don't know is what specific documents might exist that trace the continuity between Mesopotamian traditions and early Christian narratives. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, maintained from 1559 to 1966, provides a roadmap of what the Church considered dangerous knowledge. While most people know it banned scientific works like those of Galileo, it also systematically prohibited books that explored comparative religion, ancient mythology, and archaeological findings that might undermine biblical uniqueness. Scholars who wanted to study connections between Christian narratives and earlier traditions had to work in secret or risk excommunication. But perhaps the most telling evidence of systematic suppression comes from how the Church has responded to archaeological discoveries. When tablets containing the Epic of Gilgamesh were first translated in the 1872, revealing flood narratives that predated biblical accounts by over a millennium, Church authorities didn't celebrate the discovery of humanity's shared memories. They worked to discredit the findings. When Sumerian king lists and creation myths emerged throughout the 20th century, showing clear parallels to biblical narratives, the response was defensive rather than investigative. This defensive posture continues today, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Digital access to ancient texts means scholars worldwide can now compare manuscripts, analyze linguistic patterns, and trace narrative evolution without institutional gatekeepers controlling the information flow. The internet has essentially broken the Church's monopoly on managing dangerous knowledge. Modern Vatican scholars find themselves in an impossible position. They can no longer simply declare inconvenient texts, heretical, or suppress archaeological findings. Instead, they've developed more sophisticated strategies, acknowledging parallels while maintaining that biblical accounts are somehow more authentic, arguing that similarities prove divine inspiration rather than cultural transmission, or simply avoiding comparative analysis altogether. The truth is that institutional Christianity succeeded in one of history's most comprehensive censorship campaigns. For over 1,600 years, they managed to convince billions of people that their traditions emerged in isolation, that their narratives were unique divine revelations, rather than the latest versions of humanity's oldest stories. They did this not through destroying everything, that would have been too obvious, but through selective preservation, careful interpretation, and systematic discouragement of comparative research. But suppressed knowledge has a way of surfacing. Every archaeological discovery, every newly translated tablet, every digitized manuscript brings us closer to understanding the full scope of what was hidden. The Vatican's archive of silence is finally being broken by the democratization of information, and what's emerging is exactly what Thoth's wisdom preserved. The understanding that all human traditions share common roots, that divine knowledge was never the monopoly of any single institution, and that the stories we've been told about our spiritual heritage represent only carefully curated fragments of a much larger, more complex, and ultimately more fascinating truth. Here's the fundamental paradox that keeps Vatican scholars awake at night. The Anunnaki aren't threatening because they're supernatural entities. They're threatening because they're historical memory. And memory, unlike faith, can be independently verified. When you examine what actually makes religious institutions nervous, it's never the theological challenges. Christianity has survived 2,000 years of theological debate, philosophical criticism, and scientific advancement. What it struggles with is archaeological evidence that places its foundational narratives within a broader historical context. The Anunnaki represent exactly this kind of evidence, not as alien gods or demonic forces, but as the cultural memory preserved in Mesopotamian texts that clearly influenced biblical narratives. Think about how institutional Christianity has traditionally handled supernatural threats: demons, devils, competing spiritual forces. These actually strengthen the Church's position. They create external enemies that reinforce the need for religious protection and guidance. The devil serves institutional power beautifully by providing something to be saved from. But historical precedent? That's a different kind of problem entirely. The clay tablets from Mesopotamia present something far more challenging than any theological argument. They show the cultural processes through which sacred narratives developed. When you read the Epic of Gilgamesh alongside the flood narrative in Genesis, or examine the parallels between Mesopotamian creation myths and biblical cosmology, you're not encountering supernatural threats. You're witnessing the human cultural transmission that shaped what would become scripture. This is why the Vatican's archives contain extensive collections of comparative religious materials that remain largely inaccessible to general scholarship. It's not because these materials are spiritually dangerous. It's because they demonstrate that sacred scripture emerged through identifiable human cultural processes rather than unique divine revelation. And that recognition fundamentally alters the basis of religious authority. Consider how different this is from scriptural interpretation, which religious institutions claim requires specialized training and authorized guidance. Clay tablets and archaeological evidence represent democratized knowledge. Anyone can examine the artifacts, read the translations, compare the textual parallels. The evidence speaks for itself in ways that can't be controlled through interpretive authority. When Mesopotamian texts describe divine councils making decisions about humanity, and you find similar language embedded in biblical passages, the "let us make man in our image" constructions we discussed earlier, you're not dealing with matters of faith or interpretation. You're seeing documented cultural continuity. The institutional response isn't to engage with this evidence openly, but to manage access to it, control the narrative around it, and maintain interpretive authority over what it means. This reveals something crucial about how institutional power actually functions. The Vatican's fear of the Anunnaki reflects broader anxiety about losing control over humanity's origin narratives and meaning-making processes. Once people understand that biblical narratives exist within a larger tapestry of ancient Near Eastern literature and cultural development, the exclusive claims to divine revelation become much harder to maintain. But here's what makes this particularly fascinating. Other religious traditions have successfully integrated archaeological discoveries without losing spiritual relevance. Jewish scholarship has long engaged with comparative ancient Near Eastern studies, understanding biblical texts within their historical context while maintaining their spiritual significance. Eastern traditions have incorporated archaeological findings about their historical development without experiencing institutional crisis. The difference lies in how authority is structured. Traditions that locate authority in ongoing interpretation, community engagement, and historical understanding can adapt to new evidence. Systems that depend on claims of unique, exclusive revelation face a more fundamental challenge when that uniqueness is placed in historical context. What's particularly striking is how the emergence of global information access and comparative religious studies makes traditional approaches to managing dangerous knowledge increasingly unsustainable. The parallels between Mesopotamian and biblical texts are now widely accessible through academic databases, museum collections, and scholarly publications. The institutional strategy of controlling access to this information simply doesn't work in an interconnected world. This creates an interesting opportunity that institutional Christianity seems reluctant to embrace. Understanding the human historical context of sacred narratives could actually deepen rather than diminish their spiritual significance. Recognizing that biblical writers drew from broader cultural traditions doesn't diminish the spiritual insights they developed. It shows how human communities have consistently struggled to comprehend and articulate their relationship with the divine. The clay tablets from Mesopotamia don't disprove biblical narratives, they contextualize them. They show how the human search for meaning, purpose, and divine connection has been a consistent thread throughout recorded history. Rather than threatening faith, this historical continuity could be seen as evidence of humanity's persistent spiritual nature. What's really at stake isn't faith itself, but institutional control over how faith is understood and expressed. The Anunnaki represent memory of human spiritual development that predates and contextualizes current religious institutions. That memory suggests that the search for divine connection doesn't depend on institutional mediation, it's part of human nature itself. Truth and faith need not be enemies. Clay and scroll together tell a richer story than either alone. The human historical context of sacred narratives doesn't diminish their spiritual significance. It reveals scripture as part of humanity's long, continuous struggle to comprehend the divine rather than its final answer. Memory, however challenging to authority, ultimately serves truth. And truth, even when it threatens institutional power, serves something larger than any single institution's claims to exclusive access to the divine. If this exploration of how historical memory challenges institutional authority resonated with your own questions about faith, knowledge, and power, let us know by commenting, "I understood it."